Running yarn markers are my favourite way of marking my position in a round of knitting or any other situation. They're also useful as row counters and are very, very versatile. Here I have a piece of knitting that has 8 repeats in it. I've got one marker yarn in place already, and all you have to do to set up a marker yarn is to pop it between the needles at the position you want to mark. So this is my start of round position. So I've made my marker yarn here from 2 different colours of yarn, because I think it's helpful if your start of round is a unique colour. So every time I get to the grey piece of yarn, I know that I'm at the start of the round. Marker yarn needs to go underneath the working yarn. So if you are a left-hand yarn operator or continental knitter, just make sure you tuck the yarn underneath the working yarn. As you work over the top of it, then the yarn gets sandwiched in that position. When you first start a marker yarn, don't cut it too long and put it through about 50-50, so that rather, if you've got a 10-inch marker yarn, don't put 8 inches of it through and leave 2 inches sticking out. It's more likely to fall out. Once they've been in the work for a while, you're not going to have a problem with them falling out. And the other nice thing about them is they don't fall out if they're at the junction between 2 needles when working on double points. So let's get to the end of this repeat. This is double knitting, but these markers work just as well on single layer knitting. So here I am at the end of that first repeat, and here's the other end of my marker yarn. So I'm going to tuck it between the needles, take it beneath both yarns, and if I've got a lot of markers to put in, I'll start with a loop of yarn like this, so that I only end up with one end rather than 2 dangling around. So I've made 2 markers, one in this position and one in this position. And now I can carry on working over the top of it and it will be secured in place. Now let's look at what happens when the marker yarn's already in place. Here I've got an already established marker yarn, and all I have to do is tuck it between the needles and it will stay there, and it's underneath my yarn, and there it is. You don't have to flip the marker yarns every round. You can flip them when you feel like it, or you can flip them to count things. So if it was an increase round, for example, you could choose to flip the marker yarns on increase rounds, and then you can count the space between increases. You can use them on sweater sleeves. Every time you do an increase, just flip the marker yarn. You can use them as an abacus. If you flip your marker yarn when you're working, let's say, a fluffy yarn, if you flip it every 5th round, then you can just count the loops of yarn in the work rather than having to count every individual row. So I'm now at the other end of that same marker yarn, and I'm going to take this one back, tuck it down, and I can keep on carrying these yarns up the work with me, and when I run out or it becomes too short, I just tie on another piece. It's better to keep the marker yarn short and keep tying on more yarn as you need it than to be driven crazy with great long tails, which you'll probably end up sitting on in your knitting chair when you sit down to knit and pulling out of the work. If they do come out of the work, you can easily reinsert them with a darning needle. So all I need to do is just make sure I run them up that same column, and then it's good to use again. Here's another example of marker yarns, and in this case this project had a steek here, a cutting area, so almost like a seam allowance. And the only way to tell the difference between the public and private knitting in the stocking stitch area was the flipping of the marker yarn. Where you have coloured knitting, you can actually mark your steek with the stitches themselves, but you can also still use a marker yarn. Very versatile. Keep the marker yarn fine. Don't use a thick marker yarn because it will leave holes behind it. So use a fairly fine marker yarn that contrasts with the rest of your work.